Buffer Zones 101. Before we explain buffer zones, we want to discuss first why they are important. I'm about to share statistics of violence seen at the national level. Buffer zones are important because they can prevent violence at abortion clinics and lower these statistics. 8 clinic workers have been murdered since abortion was legalized in 1973. There have been 17 attempted murders, 6,400 acts of violence, 42 bombings, 181 arson cases, 399 invasions, 100 acid attacks, 663 bioterrorism threats, 175,000 acts of disruption, and 90% of patients express concerns for their safety. Now for some common vocabulary. Crisis pregnancy centers, often abbreviated CPCs, are faith-based anti-abortion centers that falsely present themselves as women clinics. Buffer zones are a physical perimeter designated around abortion facilities to protect patients and staff as they come and go. Buffer zones are meant to protect the patients and clinic workers, but those who oppose it say that it's going to limit their free speech.
We are now going to focus on protester rights. We cannot talk about CPCs or pass buffer zone legislation without first being aware and understanding the rights that protesters have. One of the most important pieces of legislation in regards to protester rights is the FACE Act, which stands for the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, and it was passed in 1994. This act outlines what protesters can and cannot do outside of abortion clinics. It also guarantees similar rights to both protesters and patients entering the clinic. This picture depicts a group of protesters outside of the Hartford GYN Center in Connecticut. We will now show you a video of a similar group of protesters outside the clinic on a different occasion. The FACE Act prohibits the use of threat or force and physical obstruction that either injures, intimidates, or interferes with a person seeking to obtain reproductive health services or to exercise their First Amendment right of religious freedom or freedom of speech. It also prohibits intentional damage to both reproductive clinics or places of worship. There have been many controversies with the FACE Act, and many anti-choice people who believe the FACE Act is unconstitutional have two main arguments. They believe it is unconstitutional because it limits their freedom of speech and freedom of religious expression, and also because the speech is limited for only one group and therefore it lacks neutrality.
Now let's move on to the history of buffer zone legislation. The most influential legislation after Roe v. Wade was the FACE Act. As explained before, it protected patients' rights. The major victory was that it prevented anti-choice blockades. However, it was not enough. The Task Force on Violence Against Healthcare Providers by the Department of Justice concluded that violence and threats continued even after the FACE Act, and thus buffer zones were the logical step after the FACE Act. And two major court cases that have been decided on buffer zones are one, McCullen v. Coakley in 2014. This was on the Massachusetts statewide legislation, and it ruled against the buffer zone in Massachusetts. However, it did not set a precedent for future legislation, and it highlighted problematic legal nature of buffer zone legislation. Next, the Bruni v. City of Pittsburgh was ruled in favor of the city's buffer zone ordinance. The court mandated that the defendants of the buffer zone had to show the city legislature had no other alternative method of protection, and thus this can be a key point in future buffer zone legislation arguments. Next, we'll talk about the present laws in 3 different types of jurisdictions. First, the New Hampshire state law passed a 25-feet buffer zone around abortion clinics. However, it has constant legal battles. The most recent one is in the Court of Appeals in 2017, and the law was upheld. Next, the Louisville buffer zone was passed, and it was a 20-feet buffer zone around the abortion clinic. However, it has constant issues with police and enforcement. And the city is now talking about increasing resources and having specific training for protester control for the police. And next, St. Louis passed a county-wide buffer zone legislation around 8 feet around the clinic. And this was from high safety issues concerning week-long protests in the county. However, after the legislation had passed, there have been state legislators that have had pushback legislation that are known as preemptive free speech laws that act to prevent future buffer zone legislation to happen around the state. Now, the takeaways from the history are going to be that one of legality and second of enforcement. How can buffer zone legislation be enacted to protect patients while remaining constitutional? And also, how can buffer zone laws be enforced? And what would a good security infrastructure look like?
Lastly, we'll move into visions for Hartford. What can we learn from failed legislation to be successful here in Hartford? And there are 5 main points that we can take away from the history of buffer zones. First, to use specific and narrow language when passing bills. Second, to pass intermediate scrutiny with real examples of violence in the town, county, or city or state level. Third, provide a content-neutral restriction of activity and not the type of language. Fourth, anticipate a rise in protesting after and during buffer zone legislation passing. 5, plan for enforcement of buffer zones. One main point we really want you to take away is that limitation on free speech already exists. And not only that, but place-specific regulations, like a buffer zone, already exist. Some examples of these are, there are regulations on leafleting and solicitation at airports. There are already regulations on residential picketing, and there are also laws against picketing within a certain radius of a funeral. However, none of these regulations are seen as inherently suspicious or treated as discriminatory against free speech like buffer zones are. So, buffer zones are an important way to combat the violence seen at abortion clinics, but we also want to provide some alternative methods to combating this violence. A lot of the protesters seen outside of real abortion clinics are trained by the crisis pregnancy center staffs. So, if we are able to limit and combat crisis pregnancy centers, this might also, in turn, decrease the level of violence seen at abortion clinics. So these 3 methods are ways to combat crisis pregnancy centers specifically and are not directly tied to buffer zones. First is consumer fraud. Legislatures can attack false or misleading practices carried out by crisis pregnancy centers. The challenge to this is that commercial speech restrictions protect non-commercial enterprises such as crisis pregnancy centers. The second method would be church and state. If crisis pregnancy centers are receiving government funding, a case can be made if the crisis pregnancy centers are using this funding to proselytize. In Connecticut, currently, crisis pregnancy centers do not receive any government funding. However, if this starts to happen, a case can be made. The last method is malpractice. Unlicensed counselors at crisis pregnancy centers cannot practice medicine. They cannot read ultrasounds or conduct tests and practice medicine. The challenge to this, however, is finding specific cases and women who are going to come forward. Let's make Connecticut a leader in women's health. Connecticut protesters will escalate to the violence seen on a national scale. Buffer zones can prevent violence and make patients feel safe. So call legislatures and make them understand that women's health is a priority.
Now, we ask you to remember back to the statistics from the beginning. Those are real people, not just numbers. They are why legislation for buffer zones is so important, and we ask legislators to think of them as they consider how they will move forward. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening, and we hope you learned how buffer zones can play an integral role in protecting healthcare and protecting women. Thank you.